This is Mongolia, a country so big it could swallow Germany, France, and the UK and still have space left over. But here's the part that blows people's minds. 99.7% of this land is completely empty. Nearly half the entire population lives in one single city, squeezed into a tiny spot on the map. The rest? It's just land. Endless, silent land. Mongolia is the least densely populated sovereign country in the world, only about 2 people per square kilometer. And almost 70% of all Mongolians now live in cities, with Ulaanbaatar alone holding nearly half the nation's people. And yet, this emptiness didn't always exist. Just a few hundred years ago, this land was full of life, and even had more people than it does now. So, what happened? Why did Mongolia grow so empty, and why is it still empty today? One of the harshest climates on Earth, one big reason is the extreme weather. Mongolia has one of the harshest climates on Earth. Summers can get blazing hot, over 104 degrees Fahrenheit. But winters are something else entirely. Minus 40 degrees is not unusual. That's the kind of cold that can freeze your breath in mid-air. In places like Uvs and Zavkhan provinces, freezing air sinks into the valleys and just stays there, sometimes for weeks. These wild swings, from hot to cold, day to night, summer to winter, make it really hard for people to live outside the cities. You need strong houses, thick walls, constant heating, and a lot of fuel just to get through the winter. That costs money. And farming? It's nearly impossible in most areas. The land only supports one short growing season, and some places are just too cold to grow anything at all. This kind of climate doesn't support towns spread out across the land. That's why, in the past, people moved with the seasons, herding animals instead of planting crops. And even today, that old way of life is fading, as more and more people move into the cities, looking for warmth, work, and a better life. The result? Mongolia's countryside stays almost completely empty, not because no one wants it, but because nature makes it nearly impossible to stay. Dominance of the Gobi Desert. In the south, Mongolia is dominated by something massive, the Gobi Desert. It's the largest desert in Asia and one of the biggest in the world. This desert covers over 1.3 million square kilometers, stretching across nearly a third of the entire country. But this isn't the kind of desert you might imagine. It's not just sand. The Gobi is made of rocky mountains, dry gravel plains, giant sand dunes, and long, empty stretches of land with no water in sight. Rain is rare, just 100 to 200 millimeters a year, and most of it disappears quickly because of the hot, dry air. Farming here? Almost impossible. Only 1% of Mongolia's land is good for crops, and nearly all of that is far to the north, where there's more rain. Even traditional nomadic herders, who used to move with their animals across the desert, are now struggling. Droughts and deadly disease, sudden winter freezes, are getting worse, making it harder to find food and water for animals. With no stable food, no water, and no way to build a lasting home, the desert pushes people out. Challenging mountainous terrain, and in the north and west of Mongolia, the land rises sharply into some of the highest and toughest terrain in all of Asia. These are the Altai Mountains, with peaks like Khoitan, standing over 14,000 feet high, always covered in snow and ice. Even the Khangai and Khenti ranges, with their rolling hills and thick forests, make life difficult. The cold air, high altitude, and steep slopes mean it's hard to grow food, build homes, or even travel from one village to another. Building roads and railways through these mountains is slow, dangerous, and incredibly expensive. That means no easy access to schools, hospitals, or markets, which are all things people need to live well. So even if a family wanted to live in these remote valleys, they'd be cut off from almost everything. Over time, most people choose to leave or never settle there at all. Limited arable land. Only about 1% of Mongolia's land is good enough for farming. Just 1%. That's it. In fact, if you leave out tiny island nations and city-states, there are only 3 countries in the whole world with less arable land than Mongolia: Djibouti, Iceland, and Oman. And here's the shocking part. Even Albania, a country 54 times smaller, has more land for growing crops than Mongolia does. Most of that small patch is way up north, near the Orkhon and Selenge rivers, where the valleys are a little warmer and get more rain. In these areas, people can grow spring, wheat, barley, potatoes, carrots, but only once a year, and the results often change from season to season. The rest of the country? It's either too dry, too rocky, too salty, or frozen solid with something called permafrost, a layer of ice that never fully melts, even in summer. You can't plant crops on frozen soil. And don't expect much rain either. Mongolia gets far less than places like India's driest regions. In some areas, it only rains 300 millimeters a year, which is barely enough to soak the ground. That's why Ulaanbaatar, the capital, became such an important place. It sits in a valley that's lucky. It gets just enough rain, collects rich soil washed down from the mountains, and has a river, the Tool, to support life. That's why you don't see big farming towns or endless wheat fields out here. It's just not possible. Nomadic lifestyle. Instead, the wide grassy steppe is much better suited for something else, herding animals. And for thousands of years, that's exactly what Mongolian people have done. Even today, around a third of the population still lives as nomadic herders, just like their ancestors did. They move with the seasons, taking their families, animals, and jars, their traditional round tents, across the land. In winter, they settle in protected valleys to stay warm. In summer, they move to open plains where the grass is rich. It's not just a tradition, it's a way of surviving in a land that doesn't give people many other choices. Challenges to herding and climate change. But even nomadic herding, the one lifestyle that's worked here for thousands of years, is now under threat. Winters in Mongolia are usually dry and clear, but when a blizzard comes through, it can be deadly. A single bad storm can wipe out entire herds by freezing them to death, or by covering the grass with thick ice so they starve. In the brutal winter of 2009 to 2010, Mongolia lost over 8 million animals. Many herders lost everything, and with no animals left to support them, they had no choice but to move to the city. These freak storms, along with long dry spells called dzuds, have always been part of life on the steppe. But now, climate change is making them worse and more frequent. Mongolia used to experience around 20 major weather disasters a year. Now, it's more like 40. At the same time, the Gobi Desert is growing. It's creeping northward, about 6 or 7 kilometers every year, swallowing up more of the steppe. That's even less land left for grazing, and more pressure on the herders who remain. And there's another big shift happening, too. After the fall of Mongolia's communist government in the 1990s, the economy opened up fast. Around the same time, the global demand for cashmere wool exploded. To make more money, many herders started raising goats instead of sheep, because goats produce that soft, expensive cashmere. But goats are tough on the land. They rip up the roots of the grass, making it harder to grow back. Their sharp hooves tear the soil, and the strong winds blow that soil away, turning it into dust. This has made dust storms, air pollution, and droughts worse all across Mongolia. The land is wearing out. And herding, which once made life possible in Mongolia's empty spaces, is now becoming nearly impossible. Insufficient rural infrastructure and services. One big reason why much of Mongolia stays empty is because many rural areas have almost no basic infrastructure. In the countryside, you'll often find no paved roads, gas lines, proper toilets, or steady electricity. Access to important services like good hospitals and schools is also very limited, and reaching them can take hours over rough, unmarked roads. This makes rural life difficult, especially for young people who want jobs, education, and reliable medical care. So, many leave the countryside and move to cities like Ulaanbaatar, where those things are easier to find. Historical roots and the Dzungar Genocide. So far, we've seen how nature, the land, the climate, the cold, the drought, has shaped Mongolia's emptiness. But there's another reason too, one that comes from history, and it's just as powerful. Let's go back in time, to the 1200s, when Mongolia was the center of the biggest land empire the world had ever seen. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols ruled from the Pacific Ocean all the way to Europe. But after his death, the empire split into parts. The area we now call Mongolia ended up under the rule of the Dzungar Mongols. In the late 1600s, a new power rose to the east, the Qing dynasty of China. They wanted revenge, because long ago, Genghis Khan had conquered their ancestors' lands. So in 1687, They invaded Mongolia and crushed the Dzungar Khanate. The result was horrifying. Around 80% of the Mongolian population was killed. That's 8 out of every 10 people gone. It was one of the worst population crashes in the region's history, and Mongolia never truly recovered. But the tragedy didn't stop there. When the Qing dynasty took over, they brought with them something the nomads had never encountered before: disease. Unlike the Chinese, the nomadic Mongols had no immunity to things like smallpox. Just like what happened to Native Americans when Europeans arrived, entire Mongolian communities were devastated. Then came more invasions, more wars, more losses. In the 1750s, another campaign by the Qing against the remaining Dzungars wiped out up to 800,000 more people through violence and disease. And to keep control over the land, the Qing began moving ethnic Han Chinese settlers into Mongolia. They brought with them farming, cities, and more exposure to illness the nomads couldn't resist. Over time, all of this left Mongolia with a deep demographic scar, a massive land, with very few people left to fill it. Rise of Buddhism. After centuries of invasions, wars, and population loss, Mongolia entered a new chapter in its history, one shaped not by violence, but by belief. Beginning around the 16th century, Tibetan Buddhism spread across the Mongolian plateau and gradually became the dominant spiritual and political force. Over time, Buddhist monasteries grew in size and influence. By the early 20th century, they controlled as much as 20% of Mongolia's total wealth and held significant authority over land, livestock, and law. For many Mongolian families, dedicating a son to the monastery brought not only spiritual reward, but also social and economic security. As a result, a large portion of the male population became monks. Some historical estimates suggest that 1 in 3 adult men in Mongolia had taken monastic vows. These monks lived celibate lives, which naturally limited the population's ability to grow. Soviet influence and communist reforms. But Mongolia's story of emptiness doesn't end with ancient wars or Buddhist monks. In the 20th century, a new force stepped in that would change the country forever: the Soviet Union. After centuries under Qing control, Mongolia declared its independence in 1921. Behind the scenes, the Soviet Red Army was helping push out the Chinese and prop up a new communist regime. In 1924, Mongolia became the second communist country in the world, just after the Soviet Union itself. It became a tightly controlled Soviet satellite state where nearly every aspect of life. One of the first targets of the new regime was Buddhism. The Soviets saw religion as dangerous, something that could compete with communist ideology. So, between 1937 and 1939, under the shadow of Stalin's purges, tens of thousands of monks were arrested, and an estimated 17,000 were executed. Over 800 monasteries were destroyed. The entire spiritual backbone of Mongolia, centuries old, was dismantled in just a few years. In its place, the Soviets built a new system, one where people were loyal not to religion or clan, but to the Communist Party. To boost population growth, the new communist government introduced strong pro-natal policies, encouraging families to have many children through financial rewards, housing benefits, and even vacations for mothers. Some people without children were taxed, all to increase the labor supply for the Soviet-style economy. These efforts, along with improvements in healthcare and food supply, helped Mongolia's population recover from past devastation. At the same time, traditional nomadic life was disrupted, and many people were pushed towards centralized, collective systems that didn't fit well with Mongolia's geography. And even after the USSR collapsed in 1991, Mongolia was left with a legacy of systems and cities designed for a foreign ideology, one that helped fill Ulaanbaatar, but left the rest of the country even more empty. After Mongolia's communist era ended in 1990, the country went through a major shock, just like other former Soviet allies. During the communist years, especially in the 1970s, Mongolian families were very large, and the average woman had over 7 children. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, Mongolia's economy struggled, and life became more uncertain, causing birth rates to drop quickly. By the year 2001, the average woman in Mongolia was having just about 2.1 children, and that number has stayed roughly the same ever since. This big drop in the birth rate happened at the same time as many rural areas were emptying out, and fewer people were choosing to live the traditional nomadic lifestyle. Without more people being born, the population of Mongolia hasn't grown much, which means the countryside stays even emptier. That's a big concern, because Mongolia is stuck between two giant neighbors, Russia to the north and China to the south, who have hundreds of millions more people. So, today, low birth rates and a shrinking countryside population have become part of Mongolia's biggest challenges, keeping it one of the emptiest countries in the world. Thanks so much for watching this deep dive into why Mongolia is the emptiest country on Earth. Drop a comment below to let us know what you think. See you in the next video.